This is Christian Bernard Singer.
And this is Julie Oakes.
And our exhibition at the Lake Country Gallery is on the 8th day. It's a takeoff on the idea that on the 7th day everything was done in the Bible, coming from the Bible, and that on the 8th day there was the great free-for-all when man became much more involved in creation, and that's what this exhibition is based on. We have done one piece in conjunction, which are two stars on the floor, just like the stars on the Walk of Fame in the Grauman's Theater. We don't have any handprints down, but we do have the stars. This star is my star and is titled...
They didn't know how famous we were.
And this star is Christian's star and is They Didn't Know How Fabulous You Are. So there's both of our work quite often has an element of play in it.
And humor.
And humor and lightness. And we both have a similar aesthetic. So we've worked together on projects before.
We've done a couple of collaborations, but mostly Julie curated exhibitions of mine and I curated exhibitions of Julie's. And so we had this whole other really interesting relationship.
A very collegial relationship.
Well, way more than that.
In the
Really.
sense that we understand each other's language.
Yeah.
And because of that, we have a lot of fun together. But primarily, Christian and I have a very solid conversation.
Yeah. Both in terms of the work and in terms of each other's work and how we view life, really.
And because both of us work from the philosophy of inclusivity. So we're all about making those connections out to the community, and also maintaining within that sense of making connections a professionalism in terms of our own work that stands for meticulousness that we both share. And you'll see it in Christian's work with all of the tiny little insets of pine needles, and also within my work as well with this more or less obsessive detail.
And a love of color.
That's right, and a love of color.
The magic that
Yeah.
color can bring, and the ways in which ideas and conceptual positions can be so much more approached through beauty.
Mm-hmm.
So Julie and I decided to do a collaborative piece, and what that meant was we would actually each have our own pieces, but they'd be in a dialogue together. Julie and Richard made this triangle for me, and then I went to a store and got these lava rocks, and I brought some of my pine needles with me because they're very light. And I really didn't know what I was going to do, and not often that's a lot that happens in my work. I kind of start, and then as it sort of begins, I get into a process and it starts to tell me where it's going to go, and then I really get into an editing process. So in this case, we have the really super gold needles that are sort of traveling around the circle, which is actually kind of relating back to some of my Untitled Meandering series that I did some 15 years ago. And but in this case, it's kind of like a crown of thorns that leads into this kind of upside down nest, which is also kind of like the forest floor. And it's all protecting, or it's actually all protecting this little red nest of pine needles. And so it's about bringing out the preciousness of the material, and also having, I mean, the crown of thorns, it just doesn't look like pine needles anymore because it's so shiny and so metallic.
The star, for my star, I have used recycled blue bottle glass. At one point I did a blue tornado, and underneath the blue tornado was the recycled blue bottle glass. The blue tornado, incidentally, was at the museum that Christian was the curator at, another project that we did together. So the blue bottle glass is on the bottom of it. I've filtered through the blue bottle glass so that I've found the bottoms of bottles like these and then shined them up so that they sort of look like little polka dots on the bed of the dustier blue bottle glass. Around the edges are blue rocks. These are blue rocks that come from fish tanks. You buy them at the pet store. And then these two figures. I've got the pussycat lying here. The pussycat's got a feather, an eagle feather actually, in the corner of its mouth, as if it's just captured some kind of a bird and has a belly full, while the poor little hamsters are busy working on their treadmill over here, and the little baby is coming out and watching the example of the working hamsters. This piece was the first collaborative piece that we actually did together, and it's called Pass the Buddha. Pass the Buddha, this is one of 21 Buddhas that were passed between artists. This begins with me doing the initial painting on the long panel in my studio with the artist who will be participating not knowing what it is that they would be receiving. So for this I laid on the many-headed Buddha, took it over to Christian's studio where he worked on it, and then he brought it back. Quite often what we would do was 2 passes each, but when Christian brought his back, it was absolutely finished and gorgeous. This is moss that's forming the apron and forming up here as well. And Christian's work at this particular time used a lot of moss. He was doing moss installations. So the joy of Pass the Buddha was the fact that as an artist, I could never have thought this up myself. And yet, as 2 artists working together, we were able to come up with a totally different visual than anything we could have imagined beforehand. If you're wondering why the lemon is on her head, the lemon is on her head strictly as a visual. As you can see, most of the colors within it are the blues and the purples, and I wanted something that was going to be a graphic image and contrasting color to everything else that was around it. This was all about constellations and inventing some new constellations in the sky on our 8th day. So you can see, like, there's the lips, and there's the fighting birds, and there's a bunny over here. I use the rabbit a lot as part of my iconography. And this figure, the figure is actually taken from a photograph of myself, taken by Heidi Thompson. She's sort of sitting on top of the world, and she's beaming out. And I wanted something that was going to be bright and recognizable, hard-edged around the sides, and hence chose the lemon. From the lemon painting, where the beams are beaming down to is it's actually beaming down to this shoe. And this painting was about the coronavirus. It was in the very beginning when Corona had just been announced, but I had not yet seen what the virus looked like. And I was talking with an artist friend of mine who told me that it looked sort of amoebic-like, but as if it had coronas on it, like a crown. And so this was my visualization of what that was. I've got the bees, the insects sort of buzzing around the hive of her head. These are bugs coming forward. The monkeys, which are tricksters and playful, playing with the rabbit. So, and then this, the dog, is like a Chinese porcelain. So this was the one painting within the whole exhibition which actually confronted the subject matter of the coronavirus. So as Christian and I were saying earlier, we both like to try and build a sense of humor within our work, and I was doing that very much with this. Each one of these little dots right here is a makeup pad. This is actually, each one is an individual monoprint. So every night when I'm taking off my makeup, I made a little face with the lipstick that I take off and the blue around my eyes that I take off. And they then form a veil. The veil is made up of the makeup pads and also these little balls of hair, which is the hair coming from my brush that my hair is hennaed. So these are the little balls of hennaed hair that form the veil. And the veil is in front of a drawing. I'm going to pull aside the veil for a sec. The drawing of myself with my makeup on. So this is actually my chromatic personal veil. Here it is coming out of the dark with just the elements that I'm talking about in the painting. So just the hennaed hair, just the blue around the eyes, and the lipstick with a flower on the nose. My little granddaughter and I quite often like to pick the petunias and stick them up our nose. So I like the look of the flower on the nose. And then quite often artists like to sign their names on the front of their work. But since the time of modernism, probably, artists are usually not signing their pieces on the front of their work because it interferes with the visual. So on this one, and it's called Signed on the Front, I have signed it on the front, not with Oakes, as I'm usually identified, with my last name, with my surname, but instead with my first name, my feminine name, the one that says Julie. So that's how these two paintings relate to each other, by still building within it a sense of humor.
So I work with nature and natural elements, pine needles and mosses, and all of a sudden recently burrs. And I go into the forest and collect stuff that I see. I'm still kind of a tourist in the forest, in the sense that I grew up in big cities my whole life, and that's been my experience, and I'm a little uncomfortable in the forest. I'm actually a little afraid sometimes, because there's bugs, and sometimes there's dead animals, and there's other sounds that I'm not really sure what they are. But there's also this kind of energy that is vibrating all the time, and so I feel compelled to keep going in. When I first started working with mosses about 20 years ago, I found a little patch of moss and I thought, wow, this is really amazing, and I took it and I cast it in bronze, and first I made this other piece that was floating in a lake, and then I had it in my studio for about 6 months, and I'm spritzing it and looking after it, and I just couldn't commit to casting it in the bronze because it felt like I was killing a pet at this point. And finally I did the cast, and it was a beautiful piece, but at the same time I felt really guilty. But while I was going through that process, I came to realize that, I needed more moss, and I came to realize that I was not so much trespassing, but I was sort of a guest in the forest. And so at one point I started asking the forest if it would show me where mosses are or other materials I was looking for, and asking for permission to gather them. And I actually made a deal with the forest, in my mind, that I would return all of the mosses back to the forest, which I did. I kept my word for the most part, and I returned the moss to the forest. But of course, I made a piece in the forest with it. But what that did was it had me feel. I got into a relationship of respect with the forest, And even when I was gathering the mosses or the pine needles, I was just taking a little bit from here, and a little bit from there, and being very, very careful so as to not upset the scenario that was happening in the forest, the natural sort of state of the forest. And that allowed me to continue doing that work. And it was a situation where I realized that there's so much life here, and that's where I started to make the connection between my own life and the sense of being conscious of my own life and being a being that is conscious of being conscious. And that for me was a huge breakthrough, and that's when the natural materials started to reveal themselves in brand new ways that I could have never anticipated. In this piece called Breath, it's actually, I have 9 works that are collected together in a piece called Breath. And the needles are each glued individually and painted. And you can get a real sense of movement of the way the needles kind of go this way and that way, and there's almost like a breathing, but there's also maybe it's the wind affecting the needles as if it was, grasses on the prairies. And there's a suddenness and randomness to it that I think is really, for me, draws me in. And what I love about using bright colors is that you are drawn into the color, and then you're drawn into the material, and you might not know what the material is right away, which then allows a new sense of revelation in the work. Here we have Dervish and then Open on the right, and we'll get to that in a minute. Dervish is, I'm using loblolly pine needles. They're really, really long needles that actually grow from these trees in the south around Georgia and so on in the States. But I found a farmer in Ontario who was growing them. The movement of these needles is amazing, and I again have glued each one, but before gluing them I boiled them so that I could bend them and put them into a shape that I wanted to work with. And it talks about the movement of the air again, but really it talks about hurricanes and cyclones, which are increasingly disastrous now, and so we're getting into this conversation about the natural world that's in trouble. On the right is a piece called Open, and really it's kind of like an open book where the pages are open, they're revealed, they're all sort of standing in different configurations so that so you could see the entire book all at once. And it's about revelation. Revelation of the forest, revelation of the possibility of the material, and revelation about, for me, what I do and how I relate to the work.